Okay, so let's go do our review. So I sent you a summary of greater part of the material for the midterm exam. It doesn't include one large topic that we covered, and don't worry about that. We're going to talk about it today. The labor market. I'm going to tell you briefly what you need to know about the labor market. I'll try to divide up first the things that we have to know about the midterm into approximately four large groups. Then I'll talk about each one of them. In the meantime, you will be ready to ask the questions that you have. So we'll start when I list you the main topics or the main areas. Then you will have a chance to start with kick off by asking questions, and then we'll go from there. Let's see. If you have more questions, I'm going to be answering them sequentially. If you don't have questions, then I'm going to be covering what I think is the most important, more analytically demanding. So the first topic is covered in a couple of initial chapters. It has to do with the basic definition of prices, function of prices, profit, supply and demand. Supply and demand. And very closely related to that, we can treat that as a separate topic. You will get quite a few questions. From this area, maybe we can treat it as a separate question. Price controls. Price controls. Then you have big business and monopolists. Big business like a cluster of issues pertaining to big business, competition and monopoly. And finally, the labor market. So these are big business involves also the theory of corporation. Okay, so that's the basic overview. So you got all these three largely covered in your notes. Labor market is not covered, but I'm gonna go over all the important. Once again, go over all the important topics. Master for the midterm exam. So the midterm will be on Thursday. We will have no class on Thursday, and I decided eventually you will get just 35 multiple choice questions. You know, 35 multiple choice questions. So maybe one short essay questions. I haven't yet decided about that, but even if I give you an essay question, it will be a short one and just one. But for now, I'm on 35 choice questions pertaining only to business here. Okay, so let's start. Two questions. That was the plan. Again. Just
over this economies of scale again.
Oh, economies of scale. Okay, so economies of scale that pertains to big business, primarily. So economy of scale is a term pertaining to the fact that large business organizations have some advantages over small business organizations. And that's that they have a lower costs per unit, lower long-term average cost. Lower long-term costs. So economy of scale is actually if your size is 20 units, you can sell at price. Why is it important to have a lower average costs? Why is that good for the consumer? It's good. Yeah.
Prices will be lower.
Yeah, prices will be lower. So that's economy of scale is the ability of large business organizations to produce goods at lower per unit costs than small business organizations. That's an economy of scale. Economy here means savings, being economic. Not economy as an economics, as a science. Economies of scale means the savings, the cost savings that come with the larger size of the business operation. So the lower cost per unit used lead to lower prices, which is good for consumers, and this leads to comparative advantage of large business organizations over small business organizations because they can sell more cheaply. They are going to sell more than the organizations that cannot afford to sell.
So you said that with the lower costs, you're mostly going to have lower prices, but then in the notes later on, we said that the prices determine the costs. So it seems like it's reversely, yeah.
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. Actually, it spans more than one area. Can we discuss this? So the question is, I said, it seems to be in contradiction to what we said in the first one or first objectives, actually. The price determines cost. Like I say, demand determines cost. And now we say, I have a lower cost, then I can sell at lower price. It seems that the cost determines price. How to reconcile this? And it is. So when we say, when economists say that the prices determine costs, what is the meaning of that? Do you mean actually that I'm producing wine and I'm using vineyards as a production process, and the only price that influences the price of vineyard, price the land on which I grow grapes, is the price of wine? Is that correct? The price of wine goes up, the price of land on which I grow grapes will go up. Because I need the land to produce price. But what else influences? And land is my cost of production. The thing is that the other thing that they're competing demands for different things. Every production factor, or most production factors, could be used for more than one production process, for more than one utilization. Remember this example, Napa Valley Vineyards, California wines. If you can make a plum brandy or apricot brandy by using the same land to grow the orchards, then the price of land will go up. So then your cost as a winemaker will increase. And you can say legitimately from an individual point, from an individual entrepreneur's point of view, you can say that costs increase, and the cost increase independently of my selling price. Okay, but the only thing that means is actually that some other things, the prices of some competing consumer goods increased, or that a new utilization was found for the existing resource that I was using, that I have to bid up the price of this factor against other people, those who would like to use the same piece of land for making apricot brandy. So then, why the price of steel increases? You're a car producer. It's not only because the price of cars may increase because the consumers want to buy more cars. Maybe because the demand for high-rise building increases, or all other products that use steel as well. So then there is no contradiction between saying that the costs decreased or increased, and you as an individual entrepreneur treat that as an objectively given data, which is not related to your own price, because that's how you see the process, that's how you operate. And the claim that in the last instance, what determines the cost, the price of the good that is our cost, is the competing demands for it. So see, competing demands reflected in prices will determine the cost of producing wine. My cost may go up because the price of land will increase. But the price of land may increase for a variety of reasons. Primarily because the demand for land increases, because the demand for other things that you can produce by using the same piece of land. So this is the so-called concept of imputation dimension. Imputation, that the price of the factors of production, the price of the things that we use to produce consumer goods are determined by the prices of consumer goods. People are ready to pay money for steel, not because they can use or consume directly steel, but only because they can use steel to produce something else that people would want to buy. That's called imputation. The value is imputed, imprinted backwards from consumer goods. Land receives its value. Land is a valuable resource because you can use it to make wine, to make grain, to make sugar, and all other kinds of things. In and of itself, it's worthless because you cannot use it for consumption. So the difference here is between how an individual entrepreneur looks at cost and how, from a standpoint of the economic system as a whole, cost is defined. From an individual entrepreneur's point of view, cost determines prices. How high the price that you can charge will be determined by your cost. But from an economic point of view, it's the other way around. It's competing prices, competing demands will determine the prices of cost goods, let's say. Stuff like land, steel, and so on. Well, this is maybe one of the most difficult concepts to wrap your head around because there's many economists that are difficult. This was essentially discovered in late 19th century, 2 millennia of speculation about economics. People were capable of understanding this. Why we produce everything? We produce it in order to satisfy our needs, whether we produce for ourselves or whether we produce for the market for people who will pay the products. So then when we say economies of scale, now to tie in with the discussion of the economies of scale, we say my costs are going down. That says that the large company will be capable of reducing some of the costs of production, the total cost of production, primarily by increasing the efficiency of the use of some of the factors of production. So see, you can reduce your costs in many different ways. You can reduce your costs by prices going down, the prices of the goods that you use going down, but you can also reduce costs by better organizing internally business model, or by organizing it in such a way as to produce the larger quantity of goods with the given resources. So that's what the economy of scale is. So, I hope that works, that makes sense, this distinction between cost and prices. Any further questions about it? So you can think of it as increasing efficiency. If involving costs in this discussion of economies of scale complicates things too much, you can think of it as increasing efficiency. You can produce with the same amount of resources, you can produce larger quantity. So you can increase in returns. So one example of this, maybe the best way to demonstrate the economies of scale. Imagine that this is a plot of land that we use for gardening. And imagine that it's my plot of land and I want to produce potatoes. How many potatoes I will be capable of producing if I work alone? Certain quantity, but I will have to do everything. 4 or 5 operations are necessary. Tile the land, plant the potato, to take care of it. So then, once I invite somebody else to help me, our productivity will increase more than 2 times. Because of the specialization, remember, specialization of division of labor. is productive. It increases productivity. So two people together will be capable of producing, two people who work together and specialize will be capable of producing more potatoes than two people in isolation trying to work alone. Yeah. So see, it's more than 1 + 1. Total quantity of potatoes to specialize, work together to increase. Then with the third person, it's even more significant. With fourth, fifth, you have increasing returns. That's economies of scale. So one of the keys why economies of scale work is actually benefits of division of labor. That's the key. That's the key reason why a big organization can afford to produce more. You see, it's the same amount of resources, let's say 15 of us. If we work on 15 separate gardens, total quantity of potatoes that we will be capable of producing will be probably 10, 15, 20 times less than if we work together on a single plot. That's the middle factory story from Adam Smith. Adam Smith, economist, was the first to describe this phenomenon. Very simple production process making needles, and he says that the workers of very relatively low individual productivity, if they specialize, can produce 100 times more needles if every one of 4 or 5 tasks are performed by a separate person, rather than everybody trying to produce needle from the beginning. So that's the key for the efficacy of the economy of scale. Now, then the next question is, how come that then business organizations are not infinite in size? Why is there any limit to how large a firm can increase? So economies of scale stem from benefits of specialization. What is the upper limit? When a business organization stops increasing in size. Use our example of garden, version 2 garden. When is the point when we will stop adding new workers? Well, imagine that this is the size of our garden. Is 200,000 people be too much for this? Not quite. The productivity of 200,000 people working on this same plot of land will be far less than productivity of 15. Why is that? If there is an economies of scale, if specialization increases benefits, why then not increase sizing? Why don't stop increasing size? So there are also diseconomies of scale. It's the costs of increasing business. What is that? There is one primary problem in size.
Is it because it takes too long to enact change?
Yeah, it's organizational costs, management costs, coordination costs. It's easier to coordinate if you and me are working alone. Just say, I'm going to do this, you do that, and we separate and we try not to step on each other's feet, and we can work along. So the management cost of our business organization, two-man business organizations, are very low. With 15 people, it's a bit trickier, but we still can. The benefits of specialization are still so large that it makes sense for us to pay the cost of organizing 15 people. But as the size of the organization increases, then the cost of management becomes greater and greater, and the benefits of specialization less and less. And once the marginal managerial costs, which means the costs of adding one more worker to the payroll, for example, exceed the benefits of that, an increase in productivity or reduction of average costs. When these two things come to equilibrium, the organization becomes stable. It ceases increasing in size. Managerial cost versus specialization benefits. That's the economies versus diseconomies of scale. That's what the size of the business. So in some areas, benefits of specialization are greater, management costs are lower, vice versa. There is not one kind of template for how large an organization has to be. Okay, other questions? Prices. I'm going to go over prices briefly. Here are a couple of things. What prices allow? Market prices are pieces of information that allow the economy to coordinate activity of millions of people together. They reflect scarcity, as I said in this summary. That means the higher the price is a signal that the good in question is more scarce, which means that it's valued more in terms of other goods and services that you have to sacrifice in order to achieve or acquire one more unit per day. They also ration consumption. What does that mean? That means that if a price is low, consumption or demand will be higher, and price increases, consumption will go down. It means the prices preserve scarce goods over time. They prevent the society from over-consuming or too quickly consuming scarce resources. That's the rationing function of prices. Limiting consumption. If you don't allow prices to work, you will then create price controls, shortages, and services. We'll discuss that in a moment. Allow for profit and loss calculations. This key. Economic calculation is impossible without market prices for all goods and services, for producer goods as well as consumer goods. So, economic calculation. So, what is economic calculation? That's simply comparing costs and revenues. So, monetary prices are the only units in which such heterogeneous goods as labor, electricity, real estate, space, raw materials, services of the machines and the equipment on the one hand, and the goods that you produce, the values of all these things could be compared once in a year. There are no other ways of comparing them. Why this comparison is crucial for the efficient functioning of the economy? Because it allows the cost calculation. It allows society to make sure that any given entrepreneur is using fewer resources or less valuable resources to produce something that is more valuable. When your revenue is greater than your cost, that means that you use the scarce resources that somebody else could have utilized for other purposes to produce something that is more valuable than the sum total of the goods that you use. If I employ 5 people and consume a certain amount of electricity that other people could have used, electricity is a scarce good, we pay a price for it. We occupy the office space that other people could have occupied, and we use certain machines that somebody else could have bought and used, and we use maybe some raw material and so on. So all of these are scarce goods. When you add them up all together and calculate the monetary value of those costs, if whatever we produced by consuming those resources, by destroying essentially those resources, is more valuable than the value of those resources, then we improve together the economic efficiency of society. We created more value than we destroyed. When you work for me 8 hours, your labor services are destroyed, essentially consumed process. 8 hours that you work for me as the owner is the 8 hours that you could have worked for somebody else. A machine that works 8 hours in our firm is 8 hours less for the same machine working in some alternative organization. So monetary prices is the only way in which we can make those kinds of comparisons. Imagine if there were no market prices, we would have no way of comparing or actually making sure that resources are used efficiently. How would you compare the value on the one hand of an 8-hour labor of a certain worker and the value of the service of a machine for 6 hours? and the value of electricity that is produced, assuming that all these things will be produced, that there will be electricity, there will be prices. And the value of office space, there is no common unit of accounting that you can reduce those things to the least common denominator that you can reduce these things to, save for market prices. Now, in order to have market prices, so you follow this, you need cost accounting is necessary for economic calculation. Economic calculation is a precondition for profit and loss calculation. Profit and loss. Profit means you increase the value of societal resources. Loss means you reduce the value of societal resources. The value of stuff that we used up in the production process is greater than whatever we produce. In order to have this, you need market prices. Okay, in order to have market prices, you need supply and demand. Market prices are determined on the market as the intersection of supply and demand curves. Market price is the market equilibrium, or market price is determined at the intersection of supply and demand curves. And supply equals demand. Now, in order to have a supply and demand as a real phenomenon, you need private property rights in both consumer goods, money, and in factors of production, producing goods. In order to have supply and demand, you have to have people who are capable of supplying and demanding something. How are you going to have a supply of steel if there are no people who are the legitimate owners of steel plants or certain quantity of steel that is being produced? The concepts of supply and demand do not make any sense in a socialist plan economy in which the government is the owner of everything. Because the precondition of forming the market prices is the process of bidding up and down, negotiations of people who have resources, people who have money on the one hand, and people who have physical resources on the other. If you don't have private property bought in money and in producing consumer goods, there is no market. And then you cannot have prices. And then you cannot have profit and loss calculation. And then if you don't have profit and loss calculation, you cannot tell a good business decision from a bad business decision. Then you may end up in those crazy situations that I mentioned, that we may end up using the silver for electrical conduction, for electrical wires. But silver is technologically more optimal than copper. That's the only reason why we are not using silver is that there are market prices of silver that are 10 times or whatever it is, 10 times higher than copper. Which means it's cheaper to use copper. Although you will lose some of the electricity, the electrical resistance of copper is slightly higher than silver, so the efficiency of copper wires is slightly lower. You may lose 5 or 10 or 15% of electricity, especially in long range, the long haul transmission. But that's far less than the amount of value that society would be losing if you build everything from silver, which is 10 times, whatever, 1,000 times, 10,000 times better. It's more expensive, more value to use. So private property is necessary for supply and demand. Supply and demand are necessary to have market prices. Market prices are necessary to have profit and loss calculation. And profit and loss calculation are necessary to tell a good and efficient business decision from a bad and value destroying business decision. So that's the key, like a very brief overview of the prices. Cost, we already talked about that. Cost means opportunity cost. The concept of cost in economics is that it's subjective. It's the value that we forego by doing X instead of Y. It's subjective, which means only I can know what is the true cost of any of my actions. It's tied to an act of choice. Which means that you can know what is the true cost of your choice only at the moment when you make a choice. Once you decided, the cost might change. Why? Because your preferences change. You rank whatever. Let's say we're talking about 1 hour of your life, what you're going to do with it. And you decide to watch a baseball game. What is the cost of your choice? The cost of your choice is the second best alternative that you had at that point. So it's subjective, only you can know what is the true cost of your choice, and it's tied to an act of choice, which means only at the moment of choice you can know what is the true cost. The very next moment, the things may change, your preferences may shift, so you cannot predict based upon one act of choice what's going to happen in the future. So the preferences of individuals determine what is going to be produced, how much, and indirectly by which production processes. And preferences of consumers cannot be predicted, which means that the optimal structure of industry cannot be predicted in the long run. So that's the key reason why the centrally planned economy cannot work. Okay, so the socialism is government ownership of this Mises theorem that I mentioned, theorem of impossibility. That's just this thing that I was talking about in the last 5 minutes. It's the possibility of economic calculation in the absence of private property rights. He said socialism is economically impossible. That's what Ludwig von Mises, economist Ludwig von Mises, said. What it means is actually that if you don't have private property rights that characterize capitalism, you will not have the economic calculation that is necessary for rationalizing the economy. You will not have supply and demand without private property rights. Without supply and demand, you will have no market prices. Without market prices, no profit and loss relations. It says everything is a leak in the dark. We can use silver or gold or lead. Otherwise, we have no reason not to. Difference between demand and want, demand and need. So need is an abstract preference for something. Demand is a need that has a purchasing power and decision to do it behind itself. So we might have all kinds of different needs, but the demand reflects taking care of scarcity. The demand is actually, what is the definition of demand? How many units people will want to buy at a given price. That's 25 units, 25 chocolate cakes at $15. Okay. That's demand. And we may say, okay, but people need more. What you're actually saying that if price were lower, if scarcity were lower, people might buy more. But the price is what it is because resources are limited and people demand other things beyond chocolate cakes as well. So we need workers and electricity and office space and cars and fuel and so on, all other factors of production to produce other things. So need is not an economic category. Need is just an imprecise way of talking about subjective preferences. What people usually mean by saying that there is a need for something is actually that if something were free, people would want more of it. But the problem is that things are not free, and they're not cheaper than they are. So the demand is the only relevant economic category. Sometimes economists say effective demand, but that's a kind of pleonastic. Demand is effective. If it's not effective, it's not demand. Effective meaning that there are people with money who will buy. Demand for chocolate cakes is 25. That means that 25 chocolate cakes will be bought at this price. Not 23, not 27. Okay. Price controls. Do I need to repeat that price ceilings and price floors, the effects that they have on the economy? This is the equilibrium price. So there are two types of price controls. Price control is a government intervention or government regulation that puts the price level administratively, bureaucratically, legally at a level which is either higher or lower or higher than the equilibrium rate. So the maximum price guarantee, price that would be lower than the equilibrium price, is sometimes called price ceiling. That's the maximum price that you charge. And the price that is at a higher level than the equilibrium price, so you cannot charge lower than that, it's called price floor. So what is the result of price floor? What is the result of price ceiling? Can you just briefly overview this for me?
Price ceilings cause a shortage and price floors cause a surplus.
Okay, so that's the number one. Shortage and surplus. Number two, can you give me some examples of price ceilings and some examples of price floors? Examples. Price ceilings and rent control. Another example would be the price ceilings of basic necessities. Sometimes bread, milk, so on. They're always justified by the need to protect the standard of living of people, reduce the prices for poor people. So you see the price ceiling. This is the supply curve. This would be the quantity supplied at a lower price. This would be the quantity demanded. So then with the price ceiling, we have a quantity demanded which is greater than quantity supplied. At this price, much more people want to buy much more than they want to sell. In the equilibrium here, quantity supplied equals quantity demand. Equilibrium price is a price at which the quantity of the good that people want to sell equals the quantity that they want to buy. Market clears. It's a market clearing price, which means there are no shortages, there are no surpluses. However, this is a disequilibrium with the price ceiling, which creates a shortage. If there is no, so shortages can happen sometimes on a temporary basis, even in the free market. They tend to dissipate very quickly if there are no government controls. If you impose the government control, so what happens if there is no government control? Can somebody describe this as kind of time? What happens when you have a temporary shortage and there is no government control? What will typically happen and what? There are always two groups of people, suppliers and demanders, buyers and sellers. So now who is in a better negotiating position? Always think about the market as a process of picking up and picking down and negotiating and trying to extract as much as you can from yourself. There is more goods that are demanded than goods that are supplied. So who's in a better negotiating position? Treat sellers as one group and buyers as another group. Farmers market, centralized market. Sellers. So how are they going to exploit for their own purposes this position where they are in a better negotiating position? Yeah, you can convince me to sell more. Yeah, you want buyers, you want more goods. You can convince me. You can convince us to sell more, but you have to offer a higher price. But then as the price increases gradually, see this, the supply increases. People want to sell at higher prices. Higher price, more people will sell, and the same people will be selling more goods than before. What happens to demand? As price goes up, quantity demand increases, and this process, this gap between quantities, smaller quantity supplied and higher quantity demanded will be shrinking until it goes all the way back to the equilibrium. And the same thing will happen with a surplus, when you have quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded, who is now in a better negotiating position. Whoever is a scarcer commodity is in a better position. So demand is biased. The demand is weak and supply, there is a glut, there is a surplus. Yeah, you may convince me to buy your surpluses, but you will have to offer a lower price. So then the price will start inching down. If for whatever reason a surplus occurs on the market, as the price goes down, less and less sellers will want to sell, of course, or the price will sell less. And as the price goes down, buyers movement along the demand curve downward, lower the price by the demanded, and this process of gradual convergence of the two quantities will end up in the equilibrium of supply and price controls prevent all of these processes from ever happening. They freeze both surpluses and shortages. So what are further consequences of let's say price ceilings when it comes to rent control? So prices cannot ration consumption, so the supply will be lagging demand. What else will happen? So prices cannot ration consumption. How is consumption going to be rationed? Another way, demand is greater than supply. In a market, we decide we reduce consumption, we reduce demand by charging higher price. So people who are not ready to pay higher price, they're outside of the market. If you don't allow this mechanism to work, then the economy has to figure out some other way to ration consumption. And there are different ways. One of the ways would be, for example, when it comes to rent control apartments, actually reducing the quality of the apartments. The value, my costs are maybe 800. That's the market value of a typical apartment. So there is a rent control that says you cannot charge more than 700. So I may decide not to offer the apartment at all, or alternatively, I may decide to offer it, to increase, to maintain supply, but at what cost? Cost of not maintaining the apartment very well. Essentially, in the long run, by reducing the quality of the apartment. So essentially, you have the same quantity or similar quantity, but you have a lower quality of the good question. So that's another consequence of the price ceiling, that people might adjust the quality downward. Another consequence is that rationing to other means. Canadian healthcare, for example. Government-run healthcare. So whenever you put the price artificially low on some service, it costs subjectively whatever hip replacement costs, like $2,000. I don't know. But how much you need to pay the doctors, how much the hospital bed costs on the market, how much the service of the medical equipment costs, that's the average cost. If you say the hip replacement has to be free of charge, or to cost $10 or $100, or even more importantly, if you for other more routine medical services, you reduce the prices 10 times, or abolish prices altogether, say everything is free. What is going to happen? It's the demand curve here. Lower the price, the demand will increase. Demand increases, you cannot reduce it. You don't have enough resources to satisfy all demand. What can you do? Withhold the service. Wait lines. Yes, you can get your hip replacement, but in 6 months. You can get this or that. You can see a medical specialist. You can see what's the general practitioner and this specialist. In 3 months, 2 months. If it's not a life-threatening emergency, wait. So that's another way of rationing consumption, which is far less efficient because it comes at the cost of postponing or delay. Another way in which you can ration consumption is that you can undermine supply in the long run. That will happen both in the case of rent control and in the case of things like healthcare. So how are you going to undermine the supply of, let's say, affordable housing? Impose price controls. Very simple. Think about it in the long run. What's going to happen? Who is going to buy a rental unit of affordable housing? A landlord. How many landlords are going to buy that? If you knew that you cannot charge the full market price that will cover it, it's very few. If you're already stuck with a unit, with an affordable housing unit, you may try to hang on. You may try to suboptimally maintain the apartment. You may try to convert it into something else, office space, whatever. But for new people, there will be very, very low demand for new rental units. There is a very low demand for rental units, and very few new rental units will be built. So the supply will shrink. The supply curve will move to the left. There will be fewer apartments available. And you may end up eventually, this perverse story about price ceilings eventually lead to subsidizing wealthy people, subsidizing people who are not in the regime of price controls. So real estate. We have the construction business. It doesn't matter to them at all whether they're going to be building rental units for affordable housing or for high-end commercial real estate. They use the same labor and machinery and equipment to build houses, to build buildings. It doesn't matter to them who is paying the bill, as long as they're paid, they're going to build. So you don't have a price controls in rental in commercial real estate. So that means that people will be ready to finance new units. In New York, Chicago, places like that. You can rent it whenever you want. Law firms and investment banks and all kinds of wealthy people would want to rent the apartments, so you then invest. So then part of the labor and capital and equipment that would be used without the price ceiling to build new residential affordable housing stock will be moved to essentially producing commercial real estate for wealthy people. Reducing the price for them, of course. And increase the supply of the factors of production, the price of a rental unit in the commercial real estate will go down. So actually the final consequence of rent control would be to reduce the supply and increase the price and increase the shortage. No, not increase the price, increase the shortage and reduce the supply of affordable housing and decrease the price and increase the supply of commercial real estate. Price wars, example of that. Some examples of that. Minimum wage. What is the entire? So this now covers partially the labor market discussion. Is number 4. So why the minimum wage? This is $10 minimum wage, which is determined by the market. This is $15 minimum wage prescribed by the government. It will create a surplus of labor. Quantity supplied will be greater than quantity demanded. Just an excess unemployment will be created. So surplus will be maintained forever. So you have all other price guarantees in agricultural production of the government. You produce wine or you produce milk, and if the market price is low, the government will pay you a higher guaranteed price. Price guarantees. And it always creates surpluses. That's one of the reasons why European agricultural market produces large quantities of some stuffs, because the government artificially subsidizes it by both direct subsidies and also by price guarantees. Sometimes when they are not paid this higher price, they would simply destroy it. So that those images there. And American winemakers spilling wine on Champs-Élysées because the government reneged on their promise to buy out their surpluses or spilling milk. You see now, we have hungry people dying of starvation in Africa. We have French farmers spilling hundreds of gallons of milk, Champs-Élysées, to make a point. Put it up. Okay, minimum wage is the most important, the most canonical example. Price floor. Intended and unintended consequences. Intended consequences: living wage, higher wage for the employed workers, for the local workers. The unintended consequences: higher unemployment rate. Two effects of minimum wage. Three considerations that we have to take into account. Unemployment. Surplus of labor. At this price here, more people will want to work than the number of people who will be demanded by the employers. That's the excess. At this equilibrium price here, everybody who wants to work for the minimum wage will find a job. And everybody who wants to hire somebody will find supply in this country. Here, there is a surplus. So that's number one. Number two is the distribution of jobs. That means if you prescribe legally the minimum wage of $15, then even insofar as somebody will be employed, even if you don't assume the substitution of labor by capital, which happens very often, people hire productivity. If you have imagined that the government has a way of forcing you to pay $15 minimum wage, if they, with an iron hand, control the wages that are paid, are you as an employer would you be likely to hire somebody whose productivity is $10 and pay that person $15? Or are you going to hire somebody whose productivity is $15 and pay that person $15? Yes, so you see, as one of the effects of minimum wage laws would be to discriminate against people with low productivity and to help and subsidize people of relatively higher, which is exactly contrary to what the minimum wage laws want to achieve. Living wage for the low productivity workers. So you can impose and enforce $15 minimum wage as a government. You can do that. But you cannot you cannot prevent people from hiring people whose real productivity is $15 rather than minimum wage workers. How are you going to pay them? You're a minimum wage worker, you're worth $15. Yeah, I interview both of you for the job and decide to hire you, and I say, have some kind of reasons. How is a government bureaucrat or employee to figure out who among you was a minimum wage worker? Whose productivity is high? Well, if government knew these kinds of things, we didn't need private markets. Well, government may decide how high wages for everybody. The government doesn't try that because it cannot do it. So then, one of the perverse consequences of minimum wage laws is that they favor people who don't need protection. They redistribute jobs to some degree from lower productivity workers to higher productivity. And third phenomenon is substitution effect. It means that very often nobody will get a job. If the $15 is minimum wage, we know that every production process might be completed, or every product might be produced with innumerable different combinations of factors. You can use more labor and less capital, or more capital and less labor. You can use 2 machines and 7 workers, or 25 workers in 1 machine. There are all kinds of. You can use this machine versus that machine. You can use whatever 10 workers plus a machine that costs you $12, or let's say $8 per hour. Or you can use whatever 6 workers that and a machine that costs you $14 per hour. So that's a choice. Two combinations that you can use as a producer. 10 minimum wage workers and a machine that costs you, so that would be $100 here times $8, 800 plus 8, $108. And here it would be 60 plus, no, I cannot put it this way. Let's say that you have a machine that costs $12 per hour. It doesn't make sense for you to use it in the minimum wage is $10 because your total cost will be higher than if you use 20 more workers, or 5 more workers, 10 more workers, and pay them $10. But then, if the minimum wage goes to $15, $10, then it makes sense for you to use the machine. Now, the production process that was unprofitable with the minimum wage of $10 becomes profitable. Great. Now you're going to substitute away from using labor. You will be using less labor, or you will replace the worker altogether. You may simplify even further and say, I may decide if a worker costs $10 per hour and a machine costs $12 per hour, I'm going to be using a worker. But if you say to me, you have to pay a worker $15, then I'm going to switch to the machine. It's more costly. It's going to be bad. You see, this switch to technology is not good for consumer. Because for consumer, it's better that your cost is $10 than $12 because the price will be low. So consumer doesn't want this switch from labor to machine. But that's what the employer has to do if the price goes $15. Price of labor goes to $15. And switch to $12. So this is substitution of labor. Reducing total employment is also one possible consequence. Now, how large the effect is? It depends. It depends primarily on the position of the demand and supply curves. If they look like this is the equilibrium price, this is the equilibrium quantity, and you increase the minimum wage, you see, it's not particularly large. If the demand for labor is inelastic, which means that the trade unions and laborers, there is a huge number of workers. There is a small number of workers. The demand for labor is so high and supply of workers is scarce, then the minimum wage hike will inflict less damage. The unemployment rate, the increased unemployment as a consequence of minimum wage will be low. So this inelastic demand curve means that you can increase the price of labor quite substantially. The quantity demanded will drop relatively. That's the relative vertical demand curve is inelastic demand curve, which means that a change in price leads to a very small percentage-wise, very small change in quantity. And elastic demand curve is when relatively horizontal demand curve. That means a small change in prices of everything will lead to a huge increase of the increase in quantity demand. You increase the price just a tiny bit, quantity demanded will decrease demand. So then if you have conditions like that, huge number of workers, and a very relatively strong competition among workers, means that the employers are in a good position. Then even a small increase in minimum wage, if the demand and supply of labor are relatively elastic, you will have then a huge effect. You see the surplus unemployment here, but that's one of the factors that you have to bear in mind. How the damage will be done, this excess unemployment will exist, but how large the unemployment will be depends on the elasticity of supply and demand. Now, corporations, bear in mind differences between proprietorship, partnership, and corporation. One thing, the concept of limited liability. What is limited liability? Make sure that you know that. The concept of hostile takeover. Hostile takeover. I don't have time to cover everything, but it does give you the key points. You may ask questions about any one of them. Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller, make sure that you know what they did, what were their innovations. We talked about that in class extensively. Okay. Cartels and monopolies. What is antitrust? Definition of antitrust. What are cartels? Why cartels are unstable on a free market? Trade unions, the effects of trade unions. Can trade unions increase wages? Economy-wide, and why? And list the remaining topics, and then you will get a chance to ask if you have any questions about those issues. So see, a lot of this is covered in your homework assignments. Income brackets and statistics. What are the limitations of dividing people into income brackets? Distribution of income statistics. Mises Butler theorem, or rather Bismarck and Belgrade waitress argument. Why waitress in Miami, Florida earns more money for the same work than the waitress in Belgrade, Serbia? That has to do with the productivity of the complementary factors of production and flexibility of the labor market. Opportunity cost of labor. Remember that. The reason why the waitress in Miami earns much more money is that she has the other opportunities that are much more highly paid than the alternative opportunities that the waitress in Belgrade has. So then the employer has to match the alternative offers. Okay. And even for the same work in a more productive economy, you will employ. That's Mises Butler. Why a butler in the 21st century doing the same kind of work? I think he uses the example of Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister in the 18th century. Earns 10 times, 15 times, 20 times more than the Lord Palmerston's butler. That's the same phenomenon. Alternative opportunities for earning wages for a butler in the 21st century is much greater than what is called in the 18th century. Can work as a farm hand or whatever else, the wages were pretty abysmal as compared to even to the farm hand wages nowadays. Antitrust. What is antitrust? As a concept, basically. What else? Yeah, predatory pricing. You know what is predatory pricing? I don't know. You reduce, you're a big guy, you reduce the prices in order to drive everybody else out of the market. And once you're alone, you then jack up prices in order to make up temporary losses, and then you enjoy yourself indefinitely as a monopolist. That's a quick version of the theory. See. Okay, we have 6 or 7 minutes. That should be pretty much a kind of cross-section of everything. One more thing, the regulation exists in a capitalist economy as well as in a socialist economy. So it's not enough if you have a regulation, that's not a regulation of economic activity, which means some arbitrary restriction of what business people can do and cannot do. It doesn't mean that you have socialism. You can have a regulation. So now, we have 5 or 6 minutes. Final questions about the remaining stuff in the labor market. So the stuff, the last thing that we did about the financial markets, that's not included. Just the last 3 of the labor market chapters. These are the 3 of the labor market chapters. That's the last thing that's included in the example. Any final questions?
For causation and results.
Oh, causation.
Yeah.
So in economics, actually, causation, the way how we think of causation in general is that somebody did something. And you identify who's to blame or who's to be credited. Systematic causation means that there is a network of things or a variety of things that are happening, and it's not so easy to isolate what causes what. And some consequences might be long-term and difficult to observe in the long run, unintended consequences of something. So, for example, rent controls will lead to the subsidization, to a reduction, relatively small reduction in prices of high-end commercial real estate. So the reason why is that the case is because there are 5 or 6 things that are happening as a consequence of the price control, the price ceiling, rent control, that eventually result in this thing that we see as an increase. But it's not obvious and direct to observe that in reality. It's a systematic effect of a variety of other things that are happening at the same time. Other things? Okay then. So good luck. That will be done everything. So tomorrow we don't have a class. The exam will be open. Not tomorrow, on Thursday. Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning, and you will have until midnight essentially submitted. So just make sure once you open up the assignment, you will have to finish it in one session. Probably it's going to be 75 minutes waiting for the whole. Okay, so good luck once again, and see you then next Tuesday. I will have your papers marked, your exams marked, and we will talk about it.